In this video, I'm going to show you one of the simplest and fastest things that you can do to increase the visual impact of your images when you're color grading. I'm talking about color separation, or what's sometimes called color contrast, and it's something that we should be thinking about throughout our grading process and looking for opportunities to introduce. Because from my POV as a professional colorist, I can tell you it's very rare for me to look at an image and go, gosh, there's just too much color separation. What am I going to do with all that color separation? It's much more common for me to feel like I want more color separation. I want more visual impact. I want more colorfulness in the image. And these are all things that we can get when we start to chip away at maxing out our color separation and looking for opportunities throughout our grade to do so. So let me show you how it works inside of Resolve and how I work my way through a grade, keeping color separation in mind. So right now in this timeline, I just have a group of images that I haven't done any grading on whatsoever. I've just set up my overall color management and I'm ready to dive into implementing an overall look and to doing my shot level grading. And that overall look is something that we don't want to skip right past. It's an important part of the process because that is our first big opportunity for introducing color separation. To give you a sense of what I mean, let's go over to the timeline section of my node graph, where I can apply adjustments that are going to influence or rather impact all of my shots in the timeline in the same way. And you can see I've already got a couple of LUTs turned off here that I've selected from my Voyager LUT Pack. And I've specifically selected these LUTs because they're giving me a nice baseline level of color separation. They're basically pushing some cooler colors into the bottom end of my image and some warmer colors into the top and stretching out the image along that warm, cool axis. And when I turn this off and on, you'll be able to see what I mean. Here we go, turning it on. You can see visually, as well as in the vector scope, that I'm stretching things out along that warm, cool axis. And I've already got now a really nice baseline of color separation that I would have had to push into each individual shot if I didn't have this implemented as an overall look. So I've now got a better foundation that I can begin to grade on top of. Let's do that now. Let's go back over to the clip section of our node graph and actually start to grade this shot up. So I'm going to go in and work my way through this shot like I would any. I'm going to go and open up my exposure a little bit using my offset in the exposure node. I'm going to go into my ratio node and look at controlling my contrast and my pivot a bit. It's actually looking pretty good where it's at. And now here is my next opportunity to really get some separation introduced into this image. Here in my balance node, separation is one of the main things that I am thinking about. You'll often hear colorists talk about balancing in terms of correcting the image or in terms of like getting neutral shadows or neutral highlights. For me, those things aren't as important. My two key priorities in my balance node, especially in the first pass, are to prioritize skin, make skin look great, and max out color separation. And what you're going to find is that those two things often point in the same direction and go hand in hand. So that's what I'm going to aim myself at right now when I go and I start adjusting my offset ball to try and get that maxed out color separation. Okay. So I'm just doing this with my offset right now, but I want to point something out to you that we're going to explore in a couple of different clips here today. Offset is a great foundation for making your balance adjustment. And if it gets you what you want, remember my principle from my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments, simplicity beats complexity, but also broad beats narrow. So offset is simple and it is broad. So if it gets the job done, that's where you should remain. That's the tool that you should use. But when it comes to introducing color separation, sometimes we can get more color separation by working our balance node, not just with our offset, but with our lift, gamma, and or our gain. So just to give you a sense for how this would work, I'm going to switch over to my gain for a moment and warm things up a little bit more. And now I'm going to switch back to my offset and I'm going to cool that off on that side. And that's getting me a little bit more color separation that I had a moment ago. Now, the other thing you want to be mindful of when you start moving off of just doing pure offset for your balance, it is pretty easy to go too far. You want to make sure that you're not moving into the realm of an odd or unnatural looking reproduction because you can push color separation too far, just like you can push anything too far in color grading. So be mindful of that. But with that caveat in mind, don't be afraid to move off of just using offset. Experiment with your lift and your gamma and gain and see if you can't get even further in that direction of really maxing out and articulating the colors and hues within your images. All right. So I think that's a really good start on this image. And I'm actually going to do one other thing. I'm going to go down to the secondaries branch of my node graph. I'm going to flip my color space into HSV, and I'm going to set my channels to channel 2 only, so that I'm only working on the S, or the saturation channel, within this color model. And I'm now going to increase my gamma and play my gain against it and see if I can't get a little bit more color separation by doing that. I'm going to go off and then on. Can go a little bit further with that maybe. This is going too far, kind of on purpose. Like, that's starting to feel a little bit strange in my subject's skin. But here's something else you can do. Let's go back to our balance, go back to our offset, and rebalance a little bit. So again, you want to be mindful that you're not getting overcomplicated or overcooking the grade. But if we're trying to max out color separation, sometimes you just got to try. Sometimes you just got to push it and then back it off a little bit from wherever you land, if your goal is to max that out. So if we look at just this balance and saturation node, remember just a moment ago when we turned this look on, it was already looking pretty decent in terms of color separation, right? And if we really rewind the clock and turn everything in our local grade off and everything at the shot level grade off and grab a still of that, you can see just how far we've come simply by being mindful of color separation. And this is just our primaries. This is just our first pass. So we can continue to pay attention to opportunities to introduce color separation throughout the rest of this grade. But look how far we've come just by being mindful of our color separation dimension of things in setting up our overall look and doing our initial grade on the image. Let's go over here to shot number 2 and look at how things go in this shot. So same thing, I'm going to set my exposure and my contrast. Those are both looking pretty good, to be honest. Maybe click up my contrast a hair here. And let's go over to our balance node. Work that offset to kind of warm things up a little bit. Another really good rule of thumb that you can use when you're trying to introduce color separation, make sure that you are straddling at least 2 quadrants of your vector scope with your signal mass. Just an easy sort of counter example. If I push this way the heck up here, whole signal's living up here in this single quadrant, I've got super low color separation, right? Because everything is some flavor of red, yellow. Whereas if I go back down to where I'm kind of straddling my bullseye a bit more, I'm getting much more separation between the colors in my image. Okay. And here's another example where you can absolutely try to play your gamma or your gain against your offset adjustment and just see what you can come up with. There's no right or wrong way to go about this, but it's something that you can definitely experiment with and see if you can get some interesting results. So continue to play around with those primaries and see if you can get something fun, but that's already a nice adjustment over where we started here on this image. Okay. Let's move on to shot number 3. Shot number 3 is one where I think right out of the box, the main thing that I'm seeing is I'd like to increase my saturation. I could, by the way, do this with my actual saturation knob, and that would work fine. And maybe that's exactly what we need here in this shot. So we could try that in this shot. And let's also, I'm just doing that saturation knob here in my balance node. And maybe I'm going to pair that with cooling things off a little bit in my offset. And this is one where I feel like we really could pair that offset adjustment with maybe a gain or maybe a gamma adjustment. So I'm going to warm things up in the middle and go back to my offset and cool things off. Again, want to be mindful that we're not going too crazy, but between the saturation and the adjustments I've made in my offset and my gamma, that's really starting to pop. That's really starting to help create some more separation in the image. So another example of how we can kind of prioritize that when we are working our way through a grade. Let's go over here to shot number 4 for one more example. Again, just because we're focused on separation doesn't mean we want to skip over the fundamentals. I want to set this exposure to a healthier place. I want to go to my ratio node, make sure that I'm not losing my subjects too much in the fill side of the image, like so. We can go even a little bit higher on that exposure maybe. Maybe go over here to our ratio, kind of fine tune that. Get this into a good kind of baseline position so that we feel like we can see things reasonably well. And this is another one where I feel like just as much as my balance, I really want to get the chance to increase my saturation as well. So in just a moment, I'm going to steal that saturation setup that we created in shot number 1. But for now, I'm just going to see if I can't get things a bit more separated with my balance node. Sometimes, by the way, you'll find that you really can't do that, at least not with one adjustment. And that's where I would go over and look at maybe playing 2 adjustments against each other just to see what happens when we do. Maybe it's a matter of going cool with lift and warm with our gain, something like that. Here's a version where, like, as I'm just kind of freehanding this, I'm not loving what I'm seeing. I feel like it's starting to get a little overcooked, a little unnatural when I go off and then on. So I'm going to reset that for now. And let's say that we're happy with our balance and instead go over to shot number 1, and we're going to steal our saturation adjustment and paste it. I'm going over to this shot, by the way, tapping node 4, hitting Command C. And now I'm going over to shot 4, tapping that same node and hitting Command V to paste it. And so let's maybe start here. Let's start with increasing our gamma and our gain within this sat node. And maybe now we can go over to our balance node. This is something you're going to find, by the way, when you're working with saturation and you're starting to play around with introducing saturation, whether that's with this custom saturation setup or with the saturation knob that we use in our last shot. The more you saturate, the more you're going to have to finesse your balance, because the more any imbalance is going to become obvious when you increase your overall saturation. And it's also just going to change where your balance wants to sit in general. So in this case, I'm now going to go back to my balance node and maybe cool things off just a little bit, move them a little bit away from green as well. And I feel like that's starting to look kind of nice. Maybe I've overcooked this a little bit on the saturation node. Maybe the example's gotten a little extreme. Again, something you want to be mindful of, that in pursuing separation, you don't get too crazy with things. But I feel like that's starting to look kind of nice. Somewhere around there, if we look at our before and our after, definitely moving in the right direction, right? So that's kind of how I would look at taking my initial setup and going through my first pass of a color grade, working my same fundamentals like I always do, like I always talk about here in the channel, but really paying extra attention to color separation. And this is something that is good advice, whether we're talking about separation or color grading in general. In that first pass, you should make a mess. You should throw some paint on the wall. You should have a studio that looks like this artist's studio when she's done doing her thing. You can always pull stuff back. You can always rein stuff in after that first pass. But if you don't try things, then you won't know if there's anything interesting in that direction. So kind of like I did here on shot number 1. As soon as we went back to this a moment ago, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm probably going to have to back off on this saturation that I did a little bit, but I'm glad I went too far. I would rather go too far than not go far enough, because once you've gone too far, now you've got some boundaries and you know that you're going to have to find your sweet spot somewhere within where you started and where you've ended up. So that's another good principle, whether you're talking about maxing out color separation or really imparting any other aesthetic into your images during your initial grading pass. So I hope that's some helpful ideas for how I think about color separation, the role that it plays in my color grading workflow, and how I work on seizing opportunities to introduce it into my images in my initial setup, as well as in my first color grading pass through a timeline.